So I'm curious, what television show for children do you recall from your childhood? Mr. Rogers? Captain Kangaroo? What about Blue Peter? Have you ever heard of Blue Peter? If you haven't, I'm not surprised because it's a British children's show. But it just so happens that Blue Peter is the longest running children's program in the entire world. It first aired in Britain in 1958, and it continues to this day after 62 years. Now let me introduce you to Paula Gooder. Paula Gooder was born in 1969, and she grew up watching Blue Peter. She loved the show. And she says that as a kid, her biggest dream was to get one of those Blue Peter badges, or even bigger, to be on the show itself. Well, when Paula Gooder was in her early 40s, her dream came true. One day, she got a call, and it was one of the show researchers from Blue Peter, and they asked her, "Would you like to come on Blue Peter?" And Paula said, "Absolutely, I would love to." Now, in all of her excitement, she failed to ask what they actually wanted her to do. And so a month later, I should let you know that Paula Gooder is Dr. Paula Gooder. She is a New Testament scholar. And that is why they wanted her. And a month later, the show's research person called back with more details. And they said, "This is what we want to do. We want to get a number of primary school-aged children. And we want them to come onto the program and create a nativity tableau. In other words, we want them all to dress up as nativity figures, and we want them to put it together. And then we want you, as a New Testament scholar, to come in and tell them what bits they got wrong." Well, Paula was absolutely horrified. And she suddenly discovered that she was already scheduled to do something that day. And so she passed up her childhood dream of appearing on Blue Peter. She had no desire to use her New Testament scholarship to destroy the work of 6- and 7-year-olds. But that's not all. Dr. Gooder is well aware that our nativity scenes, that our nativity plays are pulling together elements from different stories, from Matthew, from Luke, and from other early church traditions. And that what these nativity plays, what these nativity scenes do, isn't exactly what happened. It's not even exactly what each of the Gospels presents. She knows, for example, that the wise men really shouldn't be with the shepherds at the stable, because the wise men don't come for a few years later. But she still thinks these scenes, these plays, are important. They are the church getting together, reimagining, retelling these powerful stories as part of our communal life together. And what these nativity plays do, what these nativity scenes do, is they cause us to go back to the stories in the Scriptures. They cause us to be curious as to what really is in there. What does Matthew actually do or not do? What does he include or not include? What does Luke include or not include? And so these nativity scenes, these nativity tableaus, these nativity plays take us back to those stories. and take us back to consider the one these stories are about, to look at them with fresh eyes, to meditate on them. And that's what happened with me this week. I was rereading Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. I was reading once again about how Joseph and Mary make the journey from their hometown of Nazareth all the way to Bethlehem in order to be registered. Mary's not only pregnant, but she is near term. And so it happens that while they are staying in Bethlehem, the time comes for Mary to give birth. And then I read these very familiar words. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. And there were a couple of things in those familiar verses that just piqued my curiosity. The first had to do with the fact, as we all know, that Mary laid her newborn child in a manger, in a feeding trough for animals, because there was no place for them in the inn. And for the first time ever, the question that popped into my head is, well, if there had been room in the inn, what would she have done with this Jesus? I mean, would she have laid him in a crib? Did they even have cribs back then? Or perhaps they would have just slept together as a family, as is often the case in most cultures. Was it, in putting Jesus in the manger, kind of a separation that wouldn't have normally taken place? And then I begin to wonder about this so-called inn. And I'm familiar with the discussions and the debates as to whether there would have actually been an inn in Bethlehem. After all, Bethlehem is this tiny little village. It's not on the interstate. And so there are debates and discussions about whether there would actually have been what we would consider an inn. And my understanding is that if you look at the Greek word that's translated as in a lot of these English translations, this word kataluma actually probably best refers to a guest room in someone's home. And this seems to be borne out in other parts of Luke's gospel. It's fascinating, for example, because there is another place in Luke's gospel where an inn is mentioned. And you may recall that it comes from the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, in that parable, the Good Samaritan comes upon this Jew who had been robbed, beaten, and left for dead. And this Samaritan attends to his wounds, he bandages them up, he puts them on his donkey, and takes him to an inn where he takes care of him that evening. And then in the next morning, the Samaritan pays the innkeeper an amount of money and says, "When I come back, I will repay you whatever more you have used." Now, in the parable, this seems like a proper inn with a proper innkeeper, maybe an innkeeper's wife and an innkeeper's dog. But the Greek word that is translated as inn in this case isn't the same one that's used in our story tonight. But that word kataluma that we heard tonight does occur in another place in Luke's gospel. And it's interesting because it occurs on the eve of Jesus' crucifixion. The Passover is fast approaching. And Jesus tells Peter and John to go and make preparations for the Passover feast. And he gives them these instructions. When you've entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and then say to the owner of the house, The teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large room upstairs already furnished. And here is that same word, guest room. Typically what would have happened is that with Passover coming and so many people descending upon Jerusalem, the inhabitants of Jerusalem would rent out rooms, kind of like an Airbnb situation. And that's probably what's happening when Mary and Joseph arrive in Bethlehem. They would have probably have expected to stay in somebody's guest room, probably even a relative's guest room. But perhaps given the Roman registration, perhaps with lots of people traveling to Jerusalem, guest rooms were at a minimum. Or maybe the guest room they had, the one that they were staying in, was really not conducive to give birth in. But of course, as interesting as all of this is, and I can see you all at home nodding your heads, not nodding off, but fascination with these details shouldn't overshadow Luke's larger point, which is this: there was no room for them. They didn't have a place. Mary and Joseph are away from home. They are away from normal. In fact, they are 90 miles away from home, 90 miles away from what is normal. 90 miles separate them from their family and friends. And it's Christmas. There was no room for them. And yet, that is quite literally where God comes into their lives. They are nowhere where they want to be, and that is where God meets them. Mary gives birth to her firstborn. She wraps him in bands of cloth as any good mother would do. And then she lays her swaddled son in an unusual place, a manger, an animal's feeding trough. They did not have a normal place, and yet they still made a place for the Son of God. It was all they had, and it was more than enough. 2020 has been an unusual year, to say the least. We long for a return to what is normal, or even a return to something that approximates or approaches normal. We have lost much of what is familiar and comfortable and life-giving. We have lost connections with family and friends, be it through prolonged social distancing or through sickness and death. We have lost holidays. We have lost traditions and the joy that comes with them. We have lost places. Places to work. Places to learn. Places to share community. We have lost places, and so we feel out of place. We have lost this place, this house of worship, this sacred place that has always helped us find a place for God in our lives. So what do? Well, like Mary and Joseph, we do not have a place and we are nowhere where we want to be, and yet that is where God meets us. We may not have a normal place, yet we can still make a place for God. There may be no room in the inn, but there is always enough room in our lives for the God who meets us where we are, no matter how unusual or unfamiliar that place may be. So even at the end of this dark year, we gather together as we can, and we find ways to sing with the angels and to sing with all of creation, joy to the world, the Lord is come. And we find ways, along with Mary and Joseph, to find a place, to find a room, to let every heart prepare a room for the one who meets us when we are out of place. Amen.